Welcome to Bedtime Biographies. Wherever you are tonight, settled in, lights low, the day beginning to loosen its hold, you are welcome here. This is a place for slow stories, for lives told at the pace they deserve. There is no rush tonight, and nothing you need to do except rest and listen. Before we begin, if you feel moved to, you are welcome to leave a quiet comment below with where in the world you are listening from tonight. Or perhaps there is a life you have always wanted to hear, told slowly, in the dark, with care. Leave that name too, and we will find our way to it. If these stories help you sleep, the simplest way to help others find them is to subscribe. One small gesture, and someone else gets a quieter night. Now, let us begin. There is a painting. You may have seen it, or seen it reproduced so many times that it has become almost invisible through familiarity. A woman sits upright, her dark hair braided and wound with ribbons and flowers, her gaze directed straight at you. She does not smile. She does not look away. Around her neck, there may be beads of jade or coral. Her eyebrows form a single, unbroken line across her brow, like a brushstroke placed there deliberately, as if she herself had drawn it on, each morning as an act of will. The woman in the painting looks as though she has already survived something, and she has. Her name was Frida Kahlo, and the strange thing about her life is that the version most people carry, the icon, the poster, the symbol, is real, and yet it misses almost everything. She was not, to begin with, a person who expected to be remembered. She was a young woman who painted because it gave her something to do while her body was healing. She was a person who loved and was hurt and loved again, and kept a diary full of drawings no one was meant to see. She was funny and difficult and passionate, and sometimes exhausting to be close to. She was not serene. She was not, despite the images, calm. She was intensely alive in a way that made some people uncomfortable and others unable to look away. That gap between the composed, powerful figure on the canvas and the complicated, aching, laughing, raging woman who held the brush is where her real story lives. I find myself returning to one particular detail about Frida Kahlo that very few people think about. She spent years of her life lying down, weeks, then months, then entire years, flat on her back, staring at the ceiling. And from that position, that enforced stillness, she built one of the most recognizable bodies of work in the history of painting. There is something in that I have never been able to fully put down. Now let the story begin at the beginning. The house where Frida Kahlo was born and raised still stands in Coyoacan, a neighborhood in the south of what is now Mexico City. It is painted a deep, vivid blue. Locals and visitors alike call it La Casa Azul, the blue house. When Frida was a child, the walls were not yet that color. The house was quieter then, its garden a little wilder, its rooms filled with the sounds of a family making its way through an uncertain world. She was born on the 6th of July, 1907, though she would later claim the year was 1910, the year the Mexican Revolution began. It was a deliberate choice, that small revision of her own birth. She wanted her life to begin with her country's transformation. She wanted to be, from the very first moment, inseparable from Mexico itself. Her father was Guillermo Kahlo, a German-Hungarian photographer who had come to Mexico as a young man and built a life there. He was a quiet, serious person, prone to epileptic seizures that sometimes struck without warning, and he carried in him a certain melancholy that his daughter would recognize and inherit. He loved Frida in a way that was specific and attentive. He taught her to use his camera. He took her with him on his photographic expeditions. He called her his most interesting child, and she adored him with a fierceness that never entirely faded. Her mother, Matilda, was more difficult, or perhaps the relationship was simply more complicated, as relationships between daughters and mothers so often are. Matilda was a devout woman, sharp-tongued at times, and the two of them would spend years in a state of quiet tension. Frida kept a photograph of her mother on the wall of her studio for the rest of her life, which may say everything and nothing at once. The house in Coyoacán had a garden with fruit trees. There was a lemon tree and a fig tree, and in certain seasons, the air in the courtyard smelled of ripening fruit and soil. The rooms inside were cool and dim in the afternoons, the way rooms in old Mexican houses tend to be. Thick walls holding out the heat, letting in only a filtered, gentle light. There were books on the shelves. Her father's photographic equipment occupied part of the house. There was, always, the sound of the street beyond the blue walls. Vendors, children, the distant bells of the neighborhood church. Frida was the third of 4 daughters. She was not a quiet child. She was curious and argumentative and quick, and she had from early on a gift for observation that would later find its way onto canvas. But the first great rupture of her childhood came when she was 6 years old. She contracted polio, and the illness settled into her right leg, leaving it thinner and slightly shorter than the left. It would be a source of self-consciousness for years. She would learn to hide it with long skirts, with layers of fabric, with the Tijuana dresses that would later become so closely associated with her image. But as a child, she could not yet do that. Other children called her Peg-Leg Frida. She walked with a slight limp she never lost. Her father, who knew something about navigating a body that did not always cooperate, refused to treat her as fragile. He encouraged her to swim and to play football, activities that were deeply unusual for a girl of her background and time. He told her that she was stronger than she thought. Whether she believed him then is impossible to know, but she must have carried those words somewhere, because in the years ahead, she would need them. She was an exceptional student. When she was 15, she won a place at the National Preparatory School in Mexico City, one of the finest schools in the country. Very few women attended. Of the roughly 2,000 students enrolled, only 35 were girls. Frida was among them, and she arrived with her father's intelligence, her mother's stubbornness, and a great hunger to understand the world. The school was housed in a grand colonial building in the heart of the city. Its corridors were stone, its ceilings high, its atmosphere a mixture of intellectual seriousness and barely contained youthful energy. It was 1922, and Mexico was still reverberating from its revolution. Outside the school walls, muralists were covering the surfaces of public buildings with enormous, sweeping images of Mexican history, Mexican workers, Mexican soil. Politics and art were tangled together in ways that felt urgent and alive. Inside, Frida made friends quickly. She joined a group of students who called themselves the Cachuchas, named after the peaked caps they wore. And together they read voraciously, debated fiercely, and played elaborate practical jokes on teachers they found too pompous. She was one of the few girls in this circle, and she held her place among them not by being quiet, but by being sharper and funnier than almost anyone else in the room. It was at the National Preparatory School that Frida first encountered Diego Rivera. He was already famous, a large, loud, magnetic muralist who had studied in Europe and returned to Mexico to paint the walls of public buildings with images of revolution and labor and indigenous life. He came to the school to paint a mural in the auditorium, and Frida watched him work. She was young, and he was significantly older, and the relationship that would eventually develop between them was still years away. But she noticed him. She told a friend that she intended, one day, to have his child. It was probably said with a laugh, the way confident young women sometimes speak their futures as jokes before they become plans. At the time, it seemed like a passing remark, but small decisions and small moments of recognition have a way of mattering later. The year that changed everything arrived in September of 1925, when Frida was 18 years old. She had been traveling on a bus with her boyfriend at the time, a young man named Alejandro Gomez Arias, who was one of the cachuchas and someone she had been close to for some time. They had been in the city center and were making their way back to Coyoacán in the late afternoon. The bus was crowded, as buses in Mexico City always were. The streets outside were busy with the particular noise of a large city in the middle of a weekday. Vendors, motorcars, the low rumble of the city going about its business. The bus collided with a streetcar. The collision was severe. Several people were killed. Frida survived, but the list of her injuries was almost incomprehensible. Her spinal column was fractured in 3 places. Her collarbone was broken. Her right leg was shattered in 11 places. Her right foot was crushed and dislocated. Her left shoulder was dislocated. 3 ribs were broken. Her pelvis was broken in 3 places. A steel handrail had pierced her body, entering through her hip and exiting the other side. She was found lying in the wreckage. Someone had been carrying a packet of gold powder, a craft supply of some kind, and the collision had burst it open. The gold dust had settled over the debris, over the injured and the dead, over Frida herself. Those who were there later described it as a strange and terrible sight. A young woman, badly injured, lying in the rubble of the accident, covered in gold. It is one of those details that seems too vivid to be true, and yet it is. She was taken to the Red Cross hospital in the city. Her family was told that she might not survive the night. She survived the night. Then the next day, then the week, then the month. But survival was only the beginning of what would become a very long reckoning. For the first stretch of her recovery, she was immobilized entirely. A body cast, a bed, a ceiling. Weeks that bled into each other with very little to distinguish one from the next. She was in pain almost constantly. The damage to her spine and pelvis would require surgeries, rest, more surgeries. In the years that followed, she would undergo more than 30 operations in total. The accident was not a single event that ended and left her healed. It was the beginning of a relationship with physical suffering that would last for the rest of her life. Her mother had a special easel constructed that could be used while lying flat. A mirror was fitted to the underside of the canopy above her bed so that she could see herself without sitting up. And Frida, lying there in her cast, with her brushes and her pain and the long, empty hours, began to paint. She had not trained as an artist. She had thought, before the accident, that she might study medicine. She had been curious about the human body in a scientific way. interested in how things worked, how systems held together, and sometimes failed. In a strange sense, that curiosity found a different form on canvas. She began by painting her own face, not because she was vain, though she understood and used beauty as a kind of power, but because she was what was available to her. The mirror above the bed showed her face, and she painted it. She painted what she could see. There is something very straightforward about that. When you sit with it, she could not move. She had a brush and a surface. She looked at what was in front of her, and she painted it honestly. The self-portraits she would become famous for were not, at their origin, a grand artistic statement. They were a practical response to an impossible situation. The statement came later, when the rest of the world saw what she had made. During those long months of recovery, Alejandro visited when he could, and they wrote letters when he could not. The letters she sent him are still held in archives, and they are striking documents. Pages of handwriting that range from tender to desperate to darkly funny, sometimes within the same paragraph. She described her pain with a directness that did not ask for pity. She described her boredom with a kind of outrage that made clear she was not a person designed for stillness. She missed school. She missed her friends. She missed the city and the arguments and the feeling of her own life moving forward. But something was also happening in that stillness that she could not yet name. The months of enforced solitude had turned her attention inward in a way that nothing else could have. She was learning to look at herself with the same unsentimental precision she brought to everything else. And she was learning that painting, this thing she had never studied and never particularly planned, was a way of making the interior visible. A way of saying this is what it is actually like inside here. This is the truth of this body, this mind, this moment. She recovered enough, eventually, to move through the world again, not without difficulty and not without pain, but upright and moving. She returned to her life in Coyoacán. She saw her friends. She kept painting, not only in bed now, but at a table, in a chair, in the garden where the lemon and fig trees grew, and the afternoon light fell across the walls in long, warm angles. She was 20 years old, and she was just beginning. It was in 1928 that she made the decision to show her work to Diego Rivera. She had not forgotten him. He had been in Europe for part of the years since she had first seen him at the school, and had returned to Mexico to take up the work of painting the walls of the country with images of its people and its history. He was living and working in Mexico City, famous and controversial in equal measure. His politics were radical. His personal life was, by all accounts, chaotic. He was not a simple person to know. Frida took 4 of her paintings and went to find him. She was not asking for validation. She was asking for an honest opinion. She needed to know whether what she was doing was worth continuing, or whether she should direct her energy elsewhere. She found him at work on a mural, high up on scaffolding, as was his habit, and called up to him to come down. There is something characteristic in that detail. She did not wait quietly at the base of the scaffold. She called up to him. He came down. He looked at the 4 paintings, and he told her that her work had genuine quality, that she had an individual vision, that she should keep going. He also, over the weeks that followed, kept finding reasons to visit the Blue House in Coyoacán. Their courtship, if it can be called that, was not the meeting of 2 people. who softened each other. They were both sharp, both strong-willed, both inclined to say exactly what they thought at exactly the moment they thought it. What they shared was an intensity of engagement with the world, a refusal to look away from difficult things, whether in art or in politics or in the complicated business of being alive. They were also, by the time they married in August of 1929, deeply mismatched in certain ways that would cause both of them considerable pain. Diego was 22 years older than Frida. He was large, where she was small. He was already famous, where she was unknown. He was, by his own admission, and the admission of everyone who knew him, constitutionally incapable of fidelity. Frida's father, who had come to like Rivera in many ways, described the marriage as a union between an elephant and a dove, and meant it not unkindly, but accurately. Frida's mother refused to attend the wedding. There is a photograph from around this period that shows Frida and Diego standing together. She is looking at the camera with a composed, almost challenging expression. He is somewhat disheveled, vastly larger than she is, looking faintly distracted. She is wearing a Tehuana dress, long skirt, embroidered blouse, the traditional dress of the women of the Tehuantepec region of Oaxaca, which she had begun to wear regularly and would continue to wear for the rest of her life. It was not simply fashion. It was a statement about her identity, her politics, her relationship to indigenous Mexican culture, and also, practically, a way of concealing the leg that polio had made different. She wore her clothes the way she wore her face, deliberately, precisely, as part of a larger composition that she was always arranging and rearranging. They moved first to Mexico City, then to Cuernavaca, where Diego had been commissioned to paint murals for the local government building. Cuernavaca was quieter than the capital, warmer, greener, the air thick with bougainvillea and the smell of soil. Frida painted in the mornings while Diego worked. They argued. They laughed. They argued again. The rhythms of their life together were already establishing themselves, and they were not always comfortable rhythms, but they were alive, and she was working. And for a time, that was enough. Then, in late 1930, they left Mexico. Diego had been invited to the United States, first to San Francisco, then to New York, then to Detroit, to paint murals for some of the largest institutions in the country. This was a significant professional moment for him, and a significant dislocation for her. Frida did not, by her own account, particularly want to leave Mexico. She was attached to Coyoacán, to the Blue House, to the particular quality of the light in the garden and the sounds of the street she had grown up hearing. She spoke English imperfectly. She found American culture confusing in its priorities, excessive in its enthusiasms, strangely empty in certain ways she struggled to articulate. But she went. And in going, she found a new set of things to look at, a new friction against which her own sense of herself became sharper and clearer. The years in the United States would give her some of her most important paintings. They would also bring one of the deepest private losses of her life, one that she would return to in her art again and again, in images that did not explain themselves, but did not need to. They were simply there, vivid and strange and private and true, waiting for whoever was ready to understand them. But that comes a little later. For now, she is on a ship, leaving the port of Veracruz, watching the Mexican coastline recede into the distance behind her. The water is dark. The sky is wide. She is 23 years old, and the world she is sailing toward is nothing like the one she has left. The city of San Francisco received them in the winter of 1930, and it was unlike anything Frida had encountered before. The streets climbed and fell at angles that seemed almost impractical, the bay visible at the end of certain roads, like a painting hung at the far end of a corridor. The air was cold and damp in a way that was different from the cool of Mexican mornings. This was a maritime cold, carrying the smell of salt and fog, and it settled into the city in the early hours and did not always lift by midday. The buildings were tall and pale. The people moved quickly, dressed in dark coats, their breath visible in the cold air. Everything felt slightly too fast, slightly too loud, slightly too much. Frida observed all of it with the attention she brought to everything. She wrote letters home to friends in Mexico, describing what she saw with a mixture of fascination and gentle contempt that was entirely characteristic of her. The Americans, she noted, were very interested in efficiency and very uninterested in beauty. They ate badly and worked too hard and seemed to believe that the accumulation of things was the same as living well. She found their cities impressive in scale and shallow in feeling. She missed Mexico with a specific physical ache, and yet she painted. She always painted. In San Francisco, she completed several works, including a portrait of a friend and patron that showed her technical skill developing in visible ways. She was watching Diego work on his enormous murals and absorbing, without particularly meaning to, certain things about scale and intention and the relationship between art and the world it inhabits. Her own work remained small and intimate. Where Diego covered walls, Frida worked on canvases that could be held in the hands. Where he painted crowds and history, she painted one face, her own, usually, or the faces of people she loved. The difference in their approaches said something true about the difference in their natures. She also, in San Francisco, began to be noticed. She was not yet known as an artist. She was known as Diego Rivera's wife, and she was noticed in the way that beautiful and unusual-looking women are noticed in rooms full of people who have decided in advance who the important person is. She wore her Tijuana dresses to every social gathering. She wore her hair wound with ribbons and flowers, heavy pre-Columbian jewelry at her neck and wrists. And she walked into rooms filled with American artists and intellectuals and industrialists looking, as one observer noted, like a woman who had arrived from another century and was not especially impressed by this one. People were drawn to her, not only because of how she looked, though that was undeniably part of it, but because of the quality of her attention. She listened carefully and spoke directly. She laughed easily and without performance. She had opinions about everything, and she stated them without apology. In a certain kind of social setting, where most people are engaged in the careful management of what they reveal, someone who simply says what they think becomes immediately magnetic. Diego noticed how people responded to her. He was proud, and also perhaps beginning to understand that the person he had married was not simply a companion to his larger story. From San Francisco, they eventually made their way to New York, and from New York to Detroit, where Diego had been commissioned to paint a series of murals for the Detroit Institute of Arts. Detroit, in the early 1930s, was the center of American industrial power. The Ford River Rouge plant was one of the largest manufacturing complexes in the world. Thousands of workers moved through its doors each day, and the scale and noise of the place, the heat of the forges, the rhythmic percussion of the machinery, the smell of metal and oil, was exactly the kind of material Diego found inspiring. Frida found it oppressive. The city was grey in a way that felt permanent. The sky in Detroit seemed lower than it did elsewhere, pressed down by the smoke from the factories that ran day and night. The streets near the plant were working-class neighborhoods, where the houses were modest and the air smelled of industry. It was a serious city, occupied with serious and difficult work, and it did not have much time for the kind of beauty that Frida needed the way other people need food. But it was in Detroit that something happened that would move through her paintings for years afterward, quiet and persistent as a heartbeat. She became pregnant. It was not the first time. There had been a pregnancy before, earlier in their marriage, that had ended. Her body, damaged by the accident at 18, was not reliably able to carry a child to term. The injuries to her pelvis and spine had made pregnancy complicated in ways that her doctors described carefully, and she understood clearly. She wanted a child with a longing she did not often speak about directly, but which surfaced again and again in her paintings, in images of birth and loss, and the particular grief of a body that wants to do something it cannot quite manage. The Detroit pregnancy ended in miscarriage after several months. She was taken to the Henry Ford Hospital. She spent days in a bed in an American hospital, in a city she did not love, far from home, in pain that was both physical and something much harder to name. When she returned to the place they were staying, she asked Diego to bring her art supplies. The painting she made in the weeks that followed, a small, unflinching image of herself lying in a hospital bed, a tear on her face, 6 small objects floating around her connected to her by thin red threads like the threads of an umbilical cord, was unlike almost anything that had been made before. It was deeply personal, and yet it was not sentimental. It was not a painting designed to make the viewer comfortable. It showed a private grief with a precision that felt almost clinical, and yet it was also entirely and unmistakably emotional. It existed in a space that very few artists had occupied, the place where the body's experience and the interior life meet and cannot be separated. She did not make that painting for an exhibition. She did not make it because she thought the art world was waiting for it. She made it because it was what was true, and because painting had become the way she processed what was true. That the art world would later find it extraordinary was something she could not have predicted and may not have fully cared about. It was not the last painting she would make that came from that particular place of private loss, but it was the first of its kind, and it changed something in how she understood what her work was for. They left Detroit for New York in the spring of 1933. Diego had been commissioned to paint a mural at the Rockefeller Center, one of the most prestigious commissions of his life, and the city received them with considerable fanfare. New York was different from Detroit and different from San Francisco. Faster, louder, more concentrated in its energies, more interested in itself. The art world there was active and opinionated, and somewhat dazzled by Diego's reputation, and somewhat uncertain what to make of his wife. Frida found New York more bearable than Detroit, but not by much. She was homesick in a way that had become chronic, a low-level ache that colored everything. She painted a work during this period that showed her standing at the border between Mexico and the United States. On one side, the industrial machinery and grey skyscrapers of America. On the other, the ancient stones and vivid plants and deep soil of Mexico. She stands at the center in a Tijuana dress, holding a small Mexican flag, and her expression is one of composed, settled knowledge. She knows which side she belongs to. The Rockefeller mural came to an abrupt end when Diego included in it a portrait of Lenin, which the Rockefeller family had not anticipated and did not want. There were negotiations, and then there were no negotiations, and then the mural was destroyed. Diego was furious. The American art world divided itself, noisily, into those who thought it was a scandal, and those who thought the Rockefellers had every right to commission what they wanted. Frida thought the whole episode illustrated everything she had ever suspected about how money and art existed in uneasy proximity to each other. And she was probably not wrong. They sailed back to Mexico in December of 1933. Frida stood at the rail of the ship as the Mexican coastline appeared, growing larger and more specific as they approached. The particular green of the vegetation, the particular quality of the light, the warmth of the air even out on the water. She had been away for 3 years. She was 26 years old, and she was going home. But home, when they arrived, was not exactly the place she had left. Diego had arranged for a new house to be built in the San Angel neighborhood of Mexico City, a pair of adjoining buildings designed by a friend, one for him and one for her, connected by a small bridge on the upper floor. It was a modern design, quite unlike the old colonial blue house in Coyoacán. The building was angular and functional, painted in blocks of color, and it attracted comment from the artistic and intellectual community that gathered around Diego's world. It was the house of two important people, designed to say so. Frida lived in the smaller of the two structures. She painted in it, entertained in it, and found it, by her own account, never quite as comfortable as the blue house where she had grown up. She and Diego moved between the two connected buildings by that small bridge above the courtyard, and the arrangement, separate but joined, proximate but divided, said something true about the nature of their marriage that perhaps neither of them had entirely intended. The years that followed were the most difficult of Frida's personal life, and also some of the most productive of her artistic one. Diego's infidelities were not a secret, and she had known from the beginning of their marriage that fidelity was not something he was capable of in any sustained way. She had told herself, and occasionally told others, that she could accommodate this, that a great artist was a different kind of creature, subject to different rules, and that what they had together was more important than the particular damage he caused in its margins. She believed this, up to a point, and then she discovered that the woman Diego was involved with was her younger sister, Cristina. Cristina was close to Frida in the way sisters can be close, deeply known, trusted in a particular way that is different from friendship, connected by the shared specific texture of a childhood, a family, a house with a fig tree in the garden. The betrayal was not simply marital. It was intimate in a way that cut much deeper than Diego's other affairs, which had been painful but had not touched the core of who she trusted. She did not speak about it directly in the public record. She cut her hair. The long, dark hair she had always worn braided and wound with flowers, and painted herself with it shorn, sitting in a chair, dressed in a man's oversized suit, holding a pair of scissors. Around her on the floor The cut hair lies in dark coils. Above the painting, she wrote out the lyrics of a popular song. "Look, if I loved you, it was because of your hair. Now that you are bald, I don't love you anymore." It was one of the most precise things she ever made. It did not explain itself. It did not ask for sympathy. It simply showed the state of things with a clarity that was, in its own way, devastating. She and Diego separated for a period. She moved back to the blue house in Coyoacán, back to the garden and the familiar light and the smell of the neighborhood she had grown up in. She painted more in this period than she had in some time. The pain, as it had always done, went directly onto the canvas. And what emerged was not self-pity, but something more like testimony. Painting after painting that looked directly at physical and emotional suffering without flinching, and found in that unflinching gaze something that was not surrender, but endurance. It was also during this period, in the mid-1930s, that her work began to find a wider audience. She had been painting for nearly a decade by this point, and she had shown work occasionally, but she had not pursued the art world with any particular aggression. She was not, temperamentally, a self-promoter. She painted because she needed to, and she showed work because she was asked to, and she let others make of it what they would. But the paintings were accumulating, and they were unlike anything else being made. And people who encountered them found them difficult to forget. The art world of the 1930s was engaged in various ways with the movement that had come to be called Surrealism, a European movement centered in Paris, concerned with dreams and the unconscious and the strange illogic of interior experience. André Breton, one of the founders of the movement, traveled to Mexico in 1938 and encountered Frida's work. And he declared it surrealist, declared her a natural surrealist, someone who had arrived at the movement's central concerns without having been part of the movement at all. Frida disagreed. She said, with characteristic directness, that she did not paint dreams. She painted her own reality. The distinction mattered to her. The surrealists were interested in the unconscious, in the distorted and the dreamlike, in the world made strange through the operations of the sleeping mind. What Frida painted was not strange to her. It was simply true. The physical pain was real. The grief was real. The strange images in her paintings, the floating objects, the split bodies, the hearts worn outside the chest, were not distortions of reality. They were the most accurate representations of reality she knew how to make. But Breton's interest opened doors, and she was practical enough to walk through them. In the autumn of 1938, she had her first solo exhibition in New York at a gallery on Madison Avenue. Half the paintings sold before the show even opened. The critics wrote about her with a particular kind of attention, the kind that recognizes it is in the presence of something it has not seen before. She was 29 years old, and she was, suddenly, known. She stood in the gallery on the opening night in a Tijuana dress, her hair wound with flowers, her neck heavy with coral and jade. And she received the attention of the New York art world with the same composed and slightly amused expression she brought to everything. She was pleased because she was human, and success feels good. And the paintings had cost her something real, and she was glad that the cost had produced something of value. But she was not dazzled. She had always known, with the particular certainty of someone who has spent long months alone with nothing but her own honesty and a brush, that what she was making was true. The rest of the world catching up to that fact was satisfying, but it was not a surprise. What came next, however, she had not expected. From New York, she traveled to Paris in early 1939 at André Breton's invitation to exhibit her work in a show he had organized. She arrived in February, when the city was cold and grey, the Seine moving darkly between its stone banks, the bare trees along the boulevards making thin patterns against a pale sky. Paris in winter has a particular quality, beautiful in a way that is also slightly austere. The light, flat and even. The streets carrying the smell of coffee and cold stone and diesel from the buses that moved through the narrow roads of the older neighborhoods. It was a city that had been accumulating culture for centuries and was aware of the fact, and it received visitors with a combination of genuine cosmopolitanism and barely concealed self-regard. Frida found it maddening. The problems began almost immediately. Breton had not, it turned out, done the practical work of organizing the exhibition in any reliable way. The paintings she had sent ahead were held in customs. The gallery was not confirmed. She arrived expecting arrangements that did not exist and spent the first weeks in Paris navigating bureaucratic delays while staying in Breton's apartment, which she found chaotic and insufficiently clean. She wrote letters home, describing the situation with a dry humor that did not entirely conceal her exasperation. She had come a very long way for a show that was not ready. She fell ill during this period. Her foot, damaged originally in the accident, had become infected, and she spent time in a French hospital while the customs dispute continued and the exhibition remained unresolved. Lying in a hospital bed in Paris was not meaningfully different from lying in a hospital bed in Detroit, except that outside the window, the city was older, and the nurses spoke French, and the particular loneliness of being ill far from home had a slightly different texture. The exhibition eventually opened, delayed by weeks, as part of a larger surrealist show at a gallery called École. Breton had titled the show Mexique. It included not only Frida's paintings, but also Mexican folk art and pre-Columbian objects that Breton had assembled with the enthusiasm of a collector who finds in another culture a mirror for his own aesthetic theories. Frida was not entirely pleased to have her work framed in this way, as part of an exotic tableau, rather than standing on its own terms. But the paintings were on the walls, and people came to see them, and the response was serious. One painting was purchased by the Louvre, making Frida the first Mexican artist of the 20th century to have a work acquired by that institution. It was a significant moment, and she received it with the equanimity of someone who has learned not to invest too much of herself in external validation. She wrote to a friend about it briefly and moved on to complaining about the food. She had more honest friendships in Paris than she had expected. She spent time with Marcel Duchamp, whom she liked. He was practical and funny, and did not take his own mythology too seriously, qualities she valued. She met Picasso, who gave her a pair of tortoise-shell earrings shaped like hands, and taught her a Spanish song that she sang for years afterward. She spent time with photographers and painters and writers who moved through the particular world that Paris sustained in those last years before everything changed, because it was 1939 and Europe was moving towards something that everyone could feel and almost no one was speaking about directly. The newspapers carried dispatches from Germany and from the territories that Germany had already absorbed. The conversations at dinner tables in Paris had an edge of anxiety beneath the surface that the wit and wine and argument could not entirely cover. Something was coming. The city continued to be beautiful and continued to go about its life. But the light had a quality in it, those last pre-war months, that people would later struggle to describe. A kind of heightened clarity, the particular vividness of things that are about to be lost. Frida left Paris in the spring and was glad to go. She sailed back to New York, and then, as quickly as she could arrange it, back to Mexico, back to Coyoacan, back to the blue house and its garden, the lemon tree and the fig tree, the cool, dim rooms, the familiar quality of the Mexican light falling through the windows in the afternoon. But the homecoming coincided with an ending. She and Diego divorced in 1939. The exact circumstances, the precise sequence of decisions and conversations and silences that led to the legal dissolution of their marriage belong to a private record that is only partially available. What is clear is that both of them wanted it, at least at the moment it happened, and that neither of them was entirely whole afterward. She moved back into the blue house permanently. She painted the exterior that deep, vivid blue that it has retained ever since. A blue that in certain lights looks almost luminous. The color of a sky just after sunset. The color of something between day and night. Whether she chose it for a reason, or simply because it was the color she wanted, is not recorded. But it became inseparable from how the house is known, and by extension, inseparable from her. The period that followed the divorce was one of the most productive of her life, and also one of the loneliest. She painted with an intensity that her friends noticed and sometimes worried about. The canvases from this period have a quality of concentrated interiority, smaller, more dense, more private than anything she had made before. She was looking inward with the particular focus of someone who has cleared away the external structures of a life and is left with only what is actually there. What was actually there was considerable, and it was not always comfortable to look at, and she looked at it anyway. She also drank more than was good for her. She smoked heavily. The small, dark cigarettes that appear in photographs from this period, held in her fingers with a casualness that was also, in some sense, a performance of being fine when she was not entirely fine. She kept the blue house filled with people, friends, visiting artists, political companions, animals. There were always animals. Dogs and cats and birds moved through the rooms and the garden with the ease of permanent residents. A spider monkey, named Fulang Chang, who appears in several paintings, sat on her shoulder or her lap with the proprietorial calm of a creature that has decided it lives wherever it wants. The animals were not incidental. They were company in the most direct sense. They required nothing of her except presence and care, and in return, they offered the uncomplicated warmth that human relationships, with all their demands and negotiations and disappointments, sometimes could not reliably provide. She also, during this period, had several relationships of her own, with men and with women, pursued with the same directness she brought to everything. She had been discreet, mostly, while married to Diego, though not always. After the divorce, she was less interested in discretion. She loved who she loved, and she did not particularly see why that should be managed around the comfort of people who were not involved. One relationship that mattered greatly to her was with the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who had arrived in Mexico in 1937 with his wife, seeking asylum after his expulsion from the Soviet Union. Diego had been instrumental in arranging his residence in Mexico, and the Trotskys had initially lived in the Blue House as guests. Frida and Trotsky were close for a period. How close remains a matter of some historical discussion. And then the closeness faded, and they parted without apparent bitterness. When Trotsky was assassinated in Mexico City in 1940, Frida was briefly questioned by the police as someone in his circle and briefly held. She was released without charge. The episode unsettled her, not because she had any involvement in the killing, but because violence had again arrived in proximity to her life without warning, the way it had when she was 6 years old, and polio had found its way into her body, the way it had when she was 18, and the bus had met the streetcar. She was a person to whom things happened, and she had developed, over the years, a kind of watchful readiness. Not paranoia, but the particular alertness of someone who has learned that the ordinary day can turn without notice. She channeled the unsettlement, as she channeled most things, into the work. Through 1940 and into 1941, she painted some of the most complex and layered images of her career. The self-portraits from this period are not the composed, direct gazes of the earlier work. They are stranger and denser. Images in which her face appears surrounded by plants and animals and symbolic objects whose meanings overlap and contradict and resist single interpretation. She is present in all of them, always present, but the self that appears is not a fixed thing. It shifts and refracts and shows different faces depending on the angle from which you approach it. She understood, by this point, that the self-portrait was not a simple form. It was not merely a record of a face. It was a space in which questions could be held without being resolved. Questions about identity and pain and the body and love and Mexico, and what it meant to be a woman in a world that had decided in advance what women were permitted to mean. She worked in that space with increasing confidence and increasing complexity, and the paintings that resulted were among the strangest and most alive things being made anywhere in the world in those years. And then, in 1940, Diego asked if she would consider marrying him again. She thought about it. She consulted her own feelings with the same honesty she brought to the canvas. She talked to friends. She imposed conditions, practical, specific conditions about finances and the terms of their shared life. And Diego agreed to them with what seems, from the record, to have been genuine seriousness. They remarried in December of 1940 in San Francisco, where Diego had been working. It was a quiet ceremony, nothing like the first wedding. She was 33 years old, and she understood, this time, exactly what she was entering. She was not naive about Diego, and had not been for a long time. She was not choosing him because she believed he would become someone different. She was choosing him as he actually was, with the full knowledge of what that cost, because the alternative, a life without him entirely, cost something too. And she had lived both, and knew the difference. The second marriage was not easier than the first, but it was, in some ways, more honest. They had stopped performing happiness at each other and started simply living alongside each other with a degree of mutual understanding that the earlier years had not yet made possible. They remained, by all accounts, the most important people in each other's lives until the end. They moved back to Mexico and settled into a pattern. Diego working in the city, Frida working in the Blue House, seeing each other regularly, giving each other room. finding in that strange and particular arrangement something that functioned, if not smoothly, then sustainably. The Blue House in these years was a place of real vitality. It was never empty for long. Friends came and stayed for dinner and found themselves still there at midnight. The table crowded with plates and glasses, the air full of smoke and argument and laughter. Frida cooked when she was able. She was a genuine cook who took pleasure in feeding people and presided over these gatherings with a warmth that surprised people who had only known her through her paintings, which could give the impression of someone sealed inside their own suffering. In person, she was present and social and genuinely funny, with a sharp tongue and a genuine interest in other people that made them feel, when she turned her full attention on them, that they were the most interesting person in the room. The physical situation, however, was growing more difficult. The damage from the 1925 accident had never been fully addressed. Her spine, fractured in 3 places, had been managed rather than repaired, and the years of compensating for its limitations had created new problems in adjacent structures. She was in pain with increasing frequency and increasing severity. There were periods when she could not work because the pain made it impossible to hold a brush. And those periods were, for her, among the worst. Worse, sometimes, than the pain itself. The work was not separate from her life. It was the mechanism by which she processed her life. When it was taken away, even temporarily, she felt the loss of it in a way that went beyond frustration. She had surgeries. She spent months in medical corsets, in beds, in that familiar position, flat, looking up, the ceiling her landscape. She kept painting through whatever she could manage, adapting her methods to her circumstances in the practical, unsentimental way she had first learned in the months after the accident. She had a special chair made that allowed her to work in different positions. She kept brushes close to whatever surface she was confined to. In 1943, she began teaching at a newly established school of painting in Mexico City called La Esmeralda. She had not planned on teaching and was not certain she would be good at it, but she found that she was, in her own highly unorthodox way, an excellent teacher. She did not believe in academic instruction in the traditional sense. She did not set formal exercises or discuss technique in abstract terms. She took her students out into the city and asked them to look at what was actually in front of them. She asked them to paint what they saw and felt honestly, without worrying about whether it resembled anything that had been done before. Several of her students became lifelong friends and accomplished artists in their own right. They called themselves, affectionately, Los Fridos, Frida's students, and they worked with a loyalty and devotion that said something about the quality of what she gave them, which was not technique, but something harder to name and more valuable: permission to trust their own vision. As her health made traveling to the school more difficult, she moved the classes to the Blue House. Her students came to Coyoacán and worked in the garden or in the studio, and the house that had always been full of people became fuller still. There is something in the image that is worth pausing on. Frida Kahlo, in pain, in the house where she was born, teaching young artists in the garden where the fig tree grew, insisting that what matters in art is not the rules, but the honesty, and that looking at the world with clear eyes is both the simplest and most difficult thing a painter can learn to do. She had learned that herself in the hardest possible way. She was passing it on. The mid-1940s brought recognition in Mexico that had been slower to arrive than the attention she had received abroad. There is something slightly ironic in that rhythm, the way artists are sometimes more clearly seen from a distance, the way the familiar can become invisible through proximity. Mexico had known Frida Kahlo for years as Diego Rivera's wife, as a presence at political gatherings, as someone who painted small and strange personal canvases that did not fit easily into the larger movements of Mexican art. The muralists were the dominant force in Mexican painting at that time. Diego and his contemporaries were painting walls, painting history, painting the collective experience of a nation finding its identity after revolution. Frida was painting her own face, her own body, her own interior landscape. It took time for the country to understand that this was not a lesser project, but a different one. And that different did not mean smaller. In 1942, she was named a founding member of the Seminario de Cultura Mexicana, a government body established to promote Mexican cultural life. In 1943, she was awarded a place on the faculty of La Esmeralda. In 1946, she received the National Prize for Painting, one of the most significant honors the Mexican art world could bestow, for a painting called Moses that was among the most ambitious and complex works she had ever made. Moses was different from much of her other work, where her self-portraits were intimate and inward. Moses was expansive, a large canvas crowded with figures from across human history and mythology, a meditation on the origins of religion and the relationship between leaders and the people who follow them. She had read Freud's essay on Moses and been provoked by it into a visual response that drew on everything she had absorbed: Mexican mythology, pre-Columbian imagery, her own long-standing interest in the relationship between birth and death, and the structures humans build to make sense of both. When she presented the painting to a gathering of friends and patrons and was asked to explain it, she spoke for 2 hours without notes. Diego, who was present, later said it was one of the most remarkable things he had ever heard. She had that capacity, not only to make the work, but to think about it with the same depth and precision with which she had made it, and to speak about it in a way that neither reduced it to a simple message, nor allowed it to float free of meaning entirely. The recognition was gratifying, and she received it with characteristic composure. But the same years that brought professional acknowledgement brought physical deterioration that could not be managed much longer with the methods she had been using. Her spine was worsening. The doctors she had seen over the years had offered various solutions, some of which had helped in the short term, and none of which had addressed the underlying structural damage. By the mid-1940s, she was in almost constant pain, and the question was no longer whether she needed serious surgical intervention, but when and by whom. She underwent a spinal fusion operation in New York in 1946, a procedure that was at the time relatively new and carried significant risks. 4 vertebrae were fused, and a bone graft was taken from her pelvis to support the repair. She was told the recovery would take months. She was told to expect significant improvement. The improvement did not fully come. She returned to Mexico after the surgery, moving more carefully, wearing a new and more elaborate corset, hoping that the pain would gradually reduce as the body healed. It did not reduce in the way she had been promised. There were weeks when she thought it was getting better, and then the pain would return with the same or greater force, and she would understand that the surgery had not done what it was supposed to do. A second surgery was recommended, then a third, The years between 1946 and 1950 were a succession of medical interventions, recoveries that did not fully resolve, and returns to the hospital that she began to document in a diary she kept with the same precision and imagination she brought to her canvases. The diary is one of the most remarkable documents she left behind. It was not meant for publication. It was a private record, part journal, part sketchbook, part dream log, in which she wrote and drew with a freedom that her more formal work did not always permit. The handwriting changes throughout, sometimes large and rushing, sometimes small and careful, sometimes barely legible, as if the pen could hardly keep up with whatever was moving through her. The drawings are strange and tender, and sometimes disturbing. The imagery more unguarded than in the paintings. The personal mythology more explicit. She wrote about Diego with a complexity that moved between love and fury, and something beyond both that did not have a clean name. She wrote about her body with a combination of tenderness and outrage. It was her body. She had lived in it for all these years. She had made peace with it, and then been let down by it, and then made peace with it again. And the diary recorded all of those negotiations with unflinching honesty. She wrote about Mexico, and about death, and about the particular quality of certain mornings in the Blue House, when the light came through the windows and landed on the floor in a way that made everything seem, briefly, exactly as it should be. She spent much of 1950 and 1951 in the hospital, 9 months in total, across several admissions, for spinal surgeries and their complications, and the treatments that followed the complications. It was the longest sustained period of hospitalization of her life, and it pushed her to a place of real darkness that she did not always manage to conceal. She was 43 years old. She had been living with physical pain since she was 18. She was tired in a way that went deeper than exhaustion. Diego moved into the hospital to be near her. He slept in a room on the same floor. He was with her every day. Whatever the marriage had been, and it had been many things, not all of them kind. In this period, it was a sustained act of presence, and it mattered to her enormously. She painted in the hospital. She kept the diary. She received visitors and argued with them about politics, and asked them to bring her things from the market, particular foods she was craving, flowers for the room, news from the neighborhood. She refused to disappear into the illness, even when the illness was doing its best to require her full attention. When she was finally well enough to return to Coyoacan, the Blue House received her like the house it had always been, cool and solid, the garden growing with the unconcerned fidelity of plants, the blue of the exterior walls as vivid against the sky as it had always been. She moved through the rooms slowly. She sat in the garden. She looked at the lemon tree and the fig tree and the particular green of the plants in the afternoon light, and understood, with a clarity that illness sometimes brings, that she was glad to still be there to see it. She began to work again as soon as she was able. The paintings from this final period have a quality that is different from anything that came before. Looser in some ways, more urgent in others, as if the brush were moving faster than usual, trying to cover ground. The colors are vivid, almost feverish in certain canvases. The imagery is sometimes more abstract, the careful, symbolic vocabulary of the earlier work giving way occasionally to something more instinctive and less resolved. She was also in these years, more politically engaged in her public work than she had ever been. She had always been a communist. She carried her political commitments with the same unself-conscious conviction she brought to everything. But the paintings of the early 1950s began to incorporate explicitly political imagery in ways the earlier work had largely avoided. There is a portrait of Stalin among the work of this period. There is a self-portrait that incorporates a peace dove. She was not naive about politics, and some who knew her thought the explicitly ideological work was the least interesting she made. But it was honest, and honesty was always, for her, the primary criterion. Her last major public appearance was at a demonstration in Mexico City in July of 1954, just a week before she died. She was in a wheelchair by this point, her body no longer able to carry her upright for long. The demonstration was a protest against American intervention in Guatemala, where a democratically elected government had recently been overthrown in circumstances that most Mexicans of her political convictions found deeply troubling. She attended in the rain, wrapped against the cold, holding a peace sign, her face wet from the rain and drawn with the effort of being there. Photographs taken that day show her looking directly at the camera with the same unflinching gaze that appears in painting after painting across 30 years of work. Whatever was happening in her body, the gaze had not changed. She was helped back to the Blue House afterward. She was exhausted, and she was ill, and she knew, one suspects, that the demonstration had cost her something she could not entirely afford. But she had gone, because not going was not something she was capable of when something mattered to her. And this had mattered. She died on the 13th of July, 1954. She was 47 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as pulmonary embolism. She had been ill, and the illness had been serious, and she had not been well for a long time. Some who were close to her wondered privately whether the end had been entirely unintentional, whether she had, after so many years of fighting to remain, finally made a different choice. Others believed the death was entirely as recorded. The truth belongs to a private space that no biographer has fully entered. What she left on her bedside table was a notebook, open to a page on which she had written, a few days before she died, words to the effect that she hoped the departure would be joyful and that she hoped never to return. It was the kind of thing that could be read in many ways, and has been. And the uncertainty of how to read it is perhaps appropriate for a person whose entire life resisted single interpretation. Diego was devastated in a way that surprised even those who knew how much they had meant to each other. He had spent decades being the most important person in the room, the large and famous force around which other lives organized themselves. And she had been both part of that world and entirely outside it, making her own separate and irreducible thing. He said afterward that the day she died was the most terrible day of his life. He said he had not known, until she was gone, how much of what he was had been organized around her presence in the world. He lived until 1957, 3 years after her death. He spent part of that time working to establish the Blue House as a museum dedicated to her life and work, donating his own collection of her paintings and the objects she had gathered, the pre-Columbian figures, the folk art, the Tijuana dresses, the medical corsets she had painted with flowers and birds and political slogans, the brushes and pigments still arranged near the easel as if she had simply stepped away for a moment and might return. The Blue House opened as the Museo Frida Kahlo in 1958, the year after Diego died. It has been open ever since. People come from all over the world to stand in the rooms where she lived and worked, to look at the mirror above the bed where she first learned to paint herself, to walk in the garden where the light falls in the afternoon, in the way she described in her diary. They come expecting, perhaps, to find the icon, the composed, powerful image from the self-portraits, and they find instead a house that still feels inhabited, a studio that still feels active, a life that feels, in its material traces, surprisingly close. That is one of the most remarkable things about Frida Kahlo, and it is not something that can be easily explained by talent alone, or by the drama of her biography, or even by the quality of the paintings. Though all of those things are real, it is something about the nature of what she made. She painted the truth of her own experience with such precision and such courage and such refusal to soften or explain or apologize, that the paintings continued after her death to function as truth functions, timelessly, for anyone who was ready to encounter it. She painted what it felt like to be inside a body that was in pain. She painted what it felt like to love someone who was also capable of causing great harm. She painted what it felt like to be Mexican in a world that was not always sure what that meant, to be a woman in spaces that had been designed for men, to be an artist working outside the recognized movements and categories, and to trust, against all evidence of an indifferent world, that what she was making mattered. It mattered. It mattered enormously. And the strange, particular way it mattered was not decided by the galleries of New York or Paris, or the opinion of André Breton, though all of those things played their role. It was decided much earlier, in the Blue House in Coyoacán, by a young woman lying flat on her back, with a brush in her hand and a mirror above her bed, looking at her own face with the quiet and serious attention of someone who has decided that what is true is worth painting, regardless of who will ever see it. She could not have known that the whole world would eventually see it, but she painted as if it mattered anyway. That, perhaps, is the thing about her that is most worth carrying into sleep tonight. The idea that honesty, made in private, honesty made without guarantee of witness, honesty made simply because it is the truest thing you can offer, has a way of finding its audience in the end. The Blue House still stands in Coyoacán. The walls are still that deep, vivid blue. The garden still grows. The light still falls through the windows in the afternoon in the way it always has, landing on the floors of rooms where she once moved and worked and argued and laughed and suffered and painted and loved. She left the world more than 200 paintings. She left the diary. She left the letters. She left the image of a woman looking directly back at whoever is looking, without apology, without performance, with only the steady and unglamorous courage of someone who chose, again and again, to see clearly and to show what she saw. That is enough. That is more than enough. If there is another life you would like to hear told quietly in the dark, you are welcome to leave the name below. For now, let the story of Frida Kahlo rest where it belongs. In the Blue House, in the garden, in the particular quality of the light on a Mexican afternoon, in the paintings that continue to look back at us with everything they know. Sleep well.